Before we start, a couple of housekeeping comments. The webinar is scheduled to run for 45 minutes. All registrants receive a copy of the recording of this webinar via email. We'll also be taking questions from the audience as well, running our interactive polling sessions. To go and ask your questions, you just use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. A big thank you for all of you who sent your questions in advance. I'll be asking some of those as we go along. And if you experience any trouble with sound, we recommend that you exit the webinar and then log back in again. For today, I am joined by one of the world's leading experts on rare earth elements, Clint Cox, president of the Anchor House. Clint Cox founded the Anchor House in 1995 as an investment advisory firm, specializing in unique situations. In 2005, he began researching the rare earth element market and began solely focusing on the rare earth element market from 2006 onwards. Mr. Cox has been to over 100 rare earth sites and facilities worldwide, has spoken at many industry events, consulted with various agencies, and has worked with a variety of clients throughout the rare earth elements supply chain. Mr. Cox graduated with a BA in English from Colgate University in 1993. A very, very warm welcome to Clint.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to the organization as well for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you very much, Clint. One last key point to mention before we start the webinar: nothing we discuss today should be construed as investment advice. If as a result of this webinar you are interested in investing in mining companies that are involved in the exploration or production of rare earths, our only advice is to go away and do your own research. For the record, I do not hold any shares in any mining company involved in rare earths. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on to the first question. Clint, can you tell us a bit about what rare earth elements are and why they are important?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just start with rare earth elements are found at the bottom of the periodic table, sometimes referred to as the lanthanides. And just for the record, I'll list them off so that everyone knows which elements I'm talking about. It's lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, samarium, europium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, holmium, erbium, thulium, ytterbium, lutetium, and yttrium. Now, just so you know, sometimes promethium is included, but that's actually only found in nuclear reactions. So that's really there's not much of a product for that, not much of a demand. And scandium is actually a separate market. So scandium, although it's included with a lot of official resources like the USGS and others as a rare earth element, it's actually a separate market. So I won't be discussing much of that today. But also further to understand the rare earth elements, they're divided into several different things, such as light rare earth elements. And that's usually the first four in the industry because lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, and neodymium are processed together. So that's what's referred to as the lights. But officially, it also includes samarium, europium, and gadolinium. And those are all considered light rare earths. And then the heavy rare earths are terbium and everything else. So generally, that's how the market splits it. But there's a lot of nuances there. Probably don't need to get into the weeds. But let's talk about the really cool uses. So in your mobile phone, your iPhones, your Samsung, you'll have a really cool camera that can take really cool pictures. That's because lanthanum is in the glass, and that provides a really, really high clarity that allows you to pack that much photographic power into that small of a lens. And then you have when your phone vibrates, that's a rare earth motor, and then your speakers. So pretty much any compact speakers that you use for earbuds or in your phone or anything like that, those are all going to be rare earth magnet-based speakers. Then you have lasers, ceramics, thermal barrier coatings for jet engines, fluid cracking catalysts that basically turn oil into gasoline or petrol. And then when you look at, say, green energy, you have wind turbines, rechargeable batteries, auto catalysts, and electric vehicles. There's a lot of rare earth uses throughout that sector. And then the biggest market is really magnets. So if you think about pretty much every motor that's a small motor, be it in your car, with your windshield wipers or your mirrors, any kind of speakers, and a lot of sensors throughout all of technology. It's not just your phone and other things. And then appliances use a lot of magnets. So that's kind of the general uses, and that's what the rare earths are. Hopefully that's not too much there, Andrew.
No, that's actually a really, really great opening answer. I think that the question that sort of naturally stems from that is why then the re-emergence of interest in rare earths? And I guess the follow-up question to that is what's different this time to the last wave of interest that we saw in rare earth elements, say, a number of years ago?
So yeah, I mean, the easy thing to say here as far as why the emerging interest in rare earths right now is because this is right in the middle of the U.S.-China trade dispute. So, you know, some call this a trade war, some call it a dispute. No matter what it is, trade negotiation. What happened is as the U.S. started putting more and more tariffs on China, when we got to the 200 billion mark, China really didn't have too much more room to come back the other way. And so during May, when we put the 200 billion on in tariffs, then we decided to ratchet that up, and it went from 10% to 25%. And China, you know, felt they had to respond, understandably. And so they started putting out statements. The first thing was actually Xi Jinping went to JL Mag, which is a rare earth manufacturing facility. He went there, and then he went to basically a monument to the Long March. And it basically sent a message on that day, that was May 20th, that, hey, you know what? We are willing to suffer for a long time if we need to. And so, and we also have these rare earths. And it sent a really loud message to the community that, hey, we might use rare earths. Well, it actually got way, way more, I guess, specific when the People's Daily on May 31st said, hey, we're going to use rare earths. Don't say we didn't warn you. So I think that's the kind of language that obviously it's been said now by both sides that the rare earths may be used. So that's what's brought rare earths right back into the forefront, is because you have two of the biggest economies in the world going head to head, and their two leaders, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, both now understand that rare earths could be a part of this. It is very different, Andrew, and you ask a great question. You know, why is this different? There was a crisis back in 2010 and 11 with Japan and China. And during that crisis, China actually cut off Japan from having rare earths. And this created a real crisis in the industry. And you had price spikes that went from 10x to 30x on some of the rare earths. So for example, lanthanum went from $5 a kg to about $150 per kg. And that was in a very short time frame, less than a year. So that's the kind of chaos that was created by China cutting off Japan. This is much different this time. Even though this is, you know, less than a decade later, you have two very different leaders that are in charge now. You know, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are very, very strong-minded guys that know, you know, what they want. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them not to really want to push back and kind of win whatever argument this is or whatever negotiation this is. The other thing that's very different is the U.S. is the target here, not Japan. We were never targeted, you know, in the past crisis. So this is a very different feel. There's no export quotas like there were before. There's been a consolidation effort inside China, so they have a much tighter control than they did back in the previous crisis. And then you have Linus that's producing, Mountain Pass is producing, Rainbow Rare Earths is producing. You have some companies outside of China that are now producing. And then you have the entire market, the demand within the rare earth market has shifted. So you have more magnet demand, you have more electric vehicle demand, and the phosphor market, which used to be a huge demand for heavy rare earths, has almost disappeared. So in the midst of that, you also have China, you know, taking on more downstream manufacturing and more tiers of the supply chain within China. So those are kind of the, you know, kind of the general why is the re-emergence happening now, and then why is it different this time?
Thank you very much for that, Clint. So let's move on to our first poll of the webinar, and let's ask our listeners into the webinar as to why they are interested in rare earths by having our first polling question. And the question that's just coming up on your screens now is, what is your investment interest in rare earths? And for that, we have 4 options. Just curious about rare earth elements and don't plan to invest. Learning more and may invest. Plan to invest and have invested some amount already, and have invested and will be adding to my positions. So you've got a choice of 4. So I'll just leave it up on the screen for another sort of 10, 15 seconds to go and allow everyone to go and put in their vote. We'll also be coming back to the polling results later in the show and also distributing the polling results to all those after the webinar as well. I think that from that, Clint, we'll also move on to the sort of second part of my questions, which is predominantly around the US-China trade war that you've already touched on in your previous answer. Delving a little bit deeper into China and the current US-China trade relations, how is the US-China trade war driving the rare earths market? How did rare earths get caught up in the US-China trade war?
So yeah, let's dig into that a little deeper. I think it's pretty important, and really the reason why everyone's probably on this webinar. Let's go back to how did this start? If you go back to the original tariffs and kind of the trade negotiation that started, you can go back to the election. First, Trump is elected, and he said he's going to even the playing field, and I think that's very much a thing that he wants to do, is even the playing field. So, they started with the tariffs, they started putting these things on. And I think, that started, obviously China's watching this with great concern. And then we start really ratcheting it up. And, last year, I spent some time talking with some folks that, have an understanding of what was going on with the trade war. And I spent some time with those folks and said, hey, look, if you get to the point where you are pushing China beyond what they can also tariff, then they may have to go to something else. And I'm not sure that they're going to use rare earths, but this might be something that, they've used before, they might use again. So that's what happened. So early May, the US tariffs to 200 billion, 10%, then 25%. China responds with 60 billion in tariffs. Then Xi Jinping on May 20th goes to JLMAG, goes to the Long March Memorial. And then it's really that May 31st article from the People's Daily, where it says, don't say we didn't warn you. They're basically saying, we will use rare earths. Don't say we didn't warn you. Now, the fact that that's in the People's Daily, that's an official, the Communist Party often puts things out that, goes to the People's Daily, and that's kind of a quasi-official word. To give you the context of that phrase, don't say we didn't warn you, they used that in 1962 before China went to war with India over a border dispute, and before the China-Vietnam War in 1979. So that phrase has kind of a special weight and meaning, which, I think, I'm not sure the U.S. understands kind of the weight of that and what how profound that is. But the fact that they use that is a little bit disconcerting. So, this happened in 2010, 2011. Japan felt it dramatically. And I think, during that time, the US, the EU, Japan, they all started efforts to diversify their supply chain, or at least study or, researching how they could diversify their supply chain. The problem is the US didn't really correct that problem. Neither did the EU. They didn't really find other solutions. Although you did have companies like Linus get to production and have significant production now, that doesn't solve all of the outside China demand issues. So, the U.S. has more goods to place tariffs on. We could go another 325 billion. But how does China retaliate, or how do they negotiate beyond what they've already done? This is where it becomes, obviously we're glad that there was a pause taken at the G20 and there wasn't further tariffs announced. But if that happens, that's one of those things to really, really watch carefully, is if we put on more tariffs, or if, there is further degradation in relationship between us and China, where will China turn? Well, that's a great question. There's a lot of speculation out there, but they've already made it clear rare earths are one of those things. And I don't know if they can, at this point, turn back and not use that, or are they bluffing? I mean, it's a really, really big conundrum that the entire market and end users, we're all watching very carefully. So things are ratcheting up. It cooled off at G20, but still, even since G20, we've had a couple things come out, news items that kind of make it a little shaky again. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, I think that kind of leads into like one of the first questions sent in by a member of our audience that we received before the show started. And the question goes, the majority of the well-known rare earth deposits in the world outside of China are of a type and chemistry that require extremely large capital expenditures of between 200 million to 2 billion for development, thus making them uneconomic. Do you agree?
So first of all, when you look at the economics of rare earth deposits, understand that there's no easy way to look at this. This is extremely difficult, extremely complex. So you may look at the type and chemistry. So let's just say you're looking at monazite, bastnasite. These are typical rare earth minerals that have been processed both inside China and outside China. So the problem is a few things. CapEx, which is what you're talking about here, these capital expenditures, yeah, it could be 200 million, it could be 2 billion, but you could also have byproduct production. And byproduct production, just like they have at Baonobo inside China, that's an iron ore mine, but it produces rare earths as a byproduct. So there are a number of sites worldwide that could use, that could utilize what they have in place for the mining and have very low capital expenditures, but they may still have operating expenditures that are basically putting it in uneconomic range. So there's many things that go into this. I think to keep in mind that it's not just the capital expenditures, which can be very high, but it's also what's the cost per kg that it takes to put these things into the market. And I think that's a really big concern. I know that, Lynas has worked very hard to get their cost down, but there's other projects that are also looking to get their costs down, and that's always something they're trying to do. But the Chinese subsidize large portions of the supply chain within China. That makes it really difficult to compete. So yeah, I don't want to oversimplify it and say, hey, it's these are the capital expenditures, this should work. There's other minerals out there too. There's other things to factor into that. It's extremely complex. So I would say be careful just making a simple assertion, because there's many, many factors, including handling radioactivity, taking care of, processing in different jurisdictions, moving the material around. That's all needs to be considered as well.
Okay. And with that in mind, then let's move on to our second webinar polling question. And the question that will be shortly coming up on your screens is, how likely is it that China would actually cut off rare earth supplies to the US if the trade war continues? And you have 5 options to choose from. Definitely will not happen, not likely, possible, likely, or definitely will happen. And again, we'll be coming back to the polling results in the show. Let's move on to the next question. Clint, do you think China would actually cut off rare supplies if tensions between the US and China, if tensions between the US and China escalate?
So this is the big question, right? This is what we're trying to figure out right now. They might. That should be a deep concern. Recent history says they might. I mean, Japan felt this extremely detrimentally to their economy. I mean, this was a big deal. Japan really got hit with this hard. So, but some say, you look at the flip side, some say that the unintended consequences of that, cutting off Japan, that affected their trade reliability. It affected their own supply chains, actually. These are unintended consequences that you don't plan on. So if you cut off all the exports to Japan, some of those things came back into China. Some of those supply chains came back into China. So it basically cut off certain products and supply, which is really interesting. So will they do it again? could they accomplish something by doing this? It did actually bring more manufacturing short term into China because companies wanted to make sure that they had access to rare earths. So they would move manufacturing facilities in. So would that be a bad thing or would it be a good thing? This is wide open. I think understand that cutting off supply could mean many things. Targets could be, oxides, metals, magnets, or targets could be components that have rare earths or specific companies. Keep in mind, it is a really big deal for China that ZTE and Huawei have both been targets of U.S. Sanctions or cutting off or blacklisting, non-sale lists. So, ZTE and Huawei, these have been targets. So why wouldn't China specifically target U.S. companies? I don't know. This is a really tough, I wish I had the answer to this. I really don't know what's going to happen. Are they bluffing? Maybe. But what if they aren't? Can our companies source elsewhere? These are the questions that we're struggling with as an industry right now, trying to come to grips with. And, it'll be really interesting to see, how this plays out.
So I think kind of with that in mind, then let's kind of move into, I guess, to potentially some of the solutions to the rare earth supply challenge. Question, are there any other countries that can step in to cover China's supply, Clint?
So yeah, there definitely are other countries. It depends on several things. Number one, it depends on price because, the higher the price, obviously, the more competition you can have come into the market. And so that's a big question is how high will the prices go? Are they sustainable at a higher level? Because if they're not sustainable at a higher level, then when the prices go back down, does that, basically bankrupt the company? A good example of this is Molycorp actually got into production, but then Molycorp went bankrupt shortly after. And this is, on the price declines. There's other factors involved in that as well. The other thing is it takes time. So no matter where the prices go, it still takes time to get into production. So are there other countries? Yes. Australia, the US, Canada, Vietnam, Russia, Brazil, Chile, a bunch of African countries, Myanmar, Southeast Asia. There's a bunch of places that could step in. The question, of course, is who could step in the right time frame and at the right price, and could they meet the specifications that end users need?
And then just a kind of a follow-up question from that, which is again sent in by one of the members of the audience. And actually, whilst I'm asking this question, we'll actually have the answers to the first poll up on your screens. Question, how will this impact global investment on our rare earth industry in Australia?
So, this is obviously Australia has been in this for a while. You do have a producing mine right now in Mount Weld, the Linus project. But the Australian rare earth industry has a pretty long history, and there's a lot of opportunities that can be considered. If you just look at the history of Australia, they used to produce monazite in large volumes, and that was something that was, provided to the market and supported the market for years, for decades. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of junior mining companies that have been in this business since before the last crisis. They've kind of maintained their projects and kind of kept them going and maybe done some stuff in the lab, tried to figure out the next steps. So, it all depends on funding and it depends on, kind of where they get to on the technological development and, once again, handling things like radioactivity, handling things like permitting, all that stuff needs to be done like any other mining project. But Australia, they have a lot of really interesting projects for sure. There's a lot to be looked at in Australia.
And thank you very much for that, Clint. And you'll see that we have the answers to our first polling question up on the screen. What is your investment interest in rare earths? Just curious about rare earths and don't plan to invest, got 27%. Learning more and may invest, got 37%. Plan to invest or have invested some amount already, 13%, and have invested and will be adding to my positions, 23%. Another question that we got sent in by the audience, again about another country. How will Canadian resources play out in this issue? Are they an option to go and fill in voids created if China hold out on their resources, Clint?
So once again, I mean, this is very similar to Australia, Canada. There's a number of rare earth juniors in Canada that have projects that are both inside Canada and outside Canada, all over the world. And, they have potential as well. I mean, some of the potential depends on, same issues, permitting, rare earth prices, costs associated with the projects. But in general, I mean, they have a lot of companies, and some of the companies, once again, were previous to the last crisis. Some of these companies have been around a very long time. So, they have experience. They've been learning for over a decade. And, where will they be? Maybe this round of crisis, maybe that gets them the funding they need to get to that next level. That's the big question. But yeah, are there, viable Canadian resources that might be interesting? Yeah, but we have to look at the other issues that go with that. And the key one is really prices and raising the funds that are necessary.
Mm-hmm. So I think let's kind of move on and have the results of our second poll up, which was, if you recall, how likely is it that China would actually cut off rare earth supplies to the US if the trade war continues? 3% said definitely will not happen, 29% said not likely, 31% said possible, 29% said likely, and 9% said definitely will happen. So let's move on to our third and our final polling question, which is how long before the Chinese lose dominance in the rare earth market? And again, you have 5 options to choose from: 1 to 3 years, 4 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, and 11 to 20 years. And the last answer is never. And just whilst we have the polling question up on the screen, I'd like to ask Clint, is a free market theory the solution to the Chinese dominance of rare earths?
So free markets, I mean, this is a really tough question, because I think free markets and the idea of, hey, the market will take care of this is what the US and I think some of the European thinkers have said, and economists have said, look, the free market takes care of everything, so don't worry about this. If it's necessary, we'll get rare earth production, outside of China. That's a really, really tough thing to apply to this market, I believe. So let me just say this right off the bat. I think the idea of a free market is great. I'm not sure if a free market actually exists, but I think the idea is great. When it comes to strategic materials, however, I don't think it works. And that's because, once again, going back to, China, you look at the competition. China, has potential either direct or indirect subsidies at almost every level of rare earth production. So we're talking mining costs, permitting, loans, and things that come from both the municipal, provincial, even the national level. You have all kinds of subsidies that help the Chinese market. So when it comes to this, we're going to say, can you actually find a free market solution when you have a competitor that is so big that doesn't play according to free market rules? That's tough. Then you keep in mind that China could drop prices. They could flood the market. They could destroy free market players in the short term if they wanted to. They could do that. I'm not saying they would, but they could. So I'd say the free market has solved very little since the last crisis. It's solved almost nothing. We do have a few producing, companies. So I did a paper on this that talked about basically the 10-year period between 2006 and 2015, and basically junior mining companies. There was over $6 billion spent just from the top 28 juniors that. My criteria was they had to raise at least 10 million plus during that time period for rare earth development. And there was 28 companies that did that during that time period, and they raised over $6 billion. In that time, you ended up with Linus getting to production, Mountain Pass that got to production, but then they went bankrupt. Now they're retooling, and they've already publicly said it's a private company, but they're shipping material now. and then rainbow rare earths. But there was no heavy rare earths being produced outside China. So, when you look at the free market theory, that is a great theory, and that would be fantastic. But when you're looking at strategic materials and you're looking at things that matter to, industry across the board, I think, it's such a small industry. We look at this as maybe, let's just call it somewhere between $2 and $20 billion industry. That doesn't seem like it's that big, but it affects trillions of dollars worth of product. And I think that's where it's hard to make the direct connection. Like if you're a company and you're only spending a few $100,000 to maybe a few $1 million on rare earths, per year, but maybe it's at a tier 2 or 3 supplier, so you don't see it directly, you may not even understand the nuances. So I think that idea of free markets, I guess my short answer is no. The free market theory doesn't apply here. And I think we need to get beyond that if we really want solutions.
Question that's been sent in by one of the audience members. Do you see any more mergers and acquisitions like the recent Vital Kita deal?
I mean, that's definitely possible. I think it depends on how this plays out. So right now we haven't had, across the board rare earth price increases yet. We did have that back in 2010, 2011. We haven't seen that yet, and it hasn't been sustained. So I think it just depends on how this unfolds. I think this is going to be different than the last crisis, if it even becomes a crisis. I think right now it's a philosophical and theoretical crisis. The question will come as to, what happens if the Chinese actually decide to use this, even in a small amount, cut off small amounts of rare earth export, or if they decide to change some things here or there. I think, it's possible that if prices go up and things start accelerating on the money raising side, that, yeah, I think people start looking at M&A activity. I think people who understand M&A will probably, and do that as a living, will probably understand that answer or an answer better than I would, because I think there are certain things in markets that trigger M&A activity. I'm not a specialist in that. I don't understand, what triggers M&A activity, but I will say we obviously had this before. We did due diligence on a number of things in the last crisis, so I'm assuming that will happen again, but only if this gets to crisis level, true crisis level.
Mm-hmm. We've had a couple of questions sent in about refineries. Can you just talk to us a bit about plans for refineries? Are there any plans for refineries to be constructed outside of China, Clint?
So I'm sorry, can you say that one more time? What's the?
Yeah, sure. Are there any plans for refineries to be constructed outside of China?
Yeah, so there are a number of refineries outside China. There are some public, some private, some, interesting, projects that may be coming to, fruition in the future. You have some MOUs, that are in place right now, looking at doing refineries. Linus and Blue Line have an MOU to discuss the idea. I think there are a few other refineries that are being considered. Molycorp has said that they're, or not Molycorp, excuse me, MP Materials has said they're the ones that run the Mountain Pass project. They are looking at putting together, I think, a refinery by the end of next year. They are, there are a few other refineries as well that are being looked at. So yes, that's a big question. The other one is heavy rare earths. There's not a lot of heavy rare earth refinery capacity outside of China. That's really something that China dominates and hasn't really been addressed on a large scale yet.
Another question, what do you think the United States government will do to find an alternative source of rare earth elements?
Well, I mean, so the U.S. government is an interesting entity. So there's plenty of stuff going on with the U.S. government looking at alternative sources, but, I'm not sure how economic those will be or whether those will work. So for instance, there's a large effort going on with rare earths from coal. So this is from a variety of portions within the coal supply chain, possibly pulling rare earths out of the coal. So that's NETL as part of the DOE. They're working on that. And there's research on a number of fronts throughout the US government. ARPA-E and some other groups have been looking at and studying this. The DLA is always looking at, what's going on with rare earths because that's part of their mandate. So I think there's a lot, but the question is always, what's the time frame? Will this stuff succeed? Will it be economic? And is there enough money being spent on it that would get it to the next step? So, I think everything that the U.S. government does can be looked at with, some level of skepticism from an industry point of view as far as being economic. But I think a lot of what the U.S. government's doing is, probably pretty important, and at least they're engaged. I think that's important. So I think the next steps that they take, could be interesting. There could be more and more spent on these things, depending on where this crisis goes.
Okay. So let's just kind of get the results of the final polling question up that we asked a little while ago, which was how long before the Chinese lose dominance in the rare earth market? Just looking at the results here, 5% of you thought it would be 1 to 3 years, 11% thought it would be 4 to 5 years, 24% 6 to 10 years, 24% 11 to 20 years, and 35% of you thought never. Do you have any sort of thoughts and comments on those results, Clint?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, number one, that is fascinating. The fact that, that's kind of how it's seen. The rare earth industry tends to change very, very quickly. To give you some examples of this, Mountain Pass dominated for years. This was the dominant source of rare earths. And that was taken over very quickly in the mid to late 80s when Chinese sources came on stream and then started really accelerating. So that within a decade, it was pretty much over for Mountain Pass domination. But if you go back even before that, there were sources, early on that were really fantastic sources, like in India or Brazil or the US. The US actually used to produce from monazite, and then Brazil came into the market and basically knocked out the US monazite very quickly because they were just cheaper, they were better. And then India came in and pretty much knocked out Brazil. And these things happened within the course of 1 to 2 years. Now, obviously, this is a different environment. This is late 1800s, early 1900s. But the point is, things can change very, very quickly over the course of 1 or 2 years. So, if you were to ask me, I might answer somewhere along, my feelings might match, the poll there. I don't know. It could be 6 to 10 years. It might be 11 to 20. It might be never. I don't think it'll be never because there's always some new technology. All we need is someone to figure out how to process rare earths in a new way, or to figure out that we can pull it out of something that's a byproduct in a cheaper way. If that happens, then this market changes very, very quickly. The other thing that can change the market is some new application. Right now, magnetic rare earths, say your neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, dysprosium, those dominate the market because magnetic applications are absolutely key. And so if there's a new application that uses some new rare earth, say, ytterbium or thulium, if that becomes the number one use, then all of a sudden it changes where you get the material from. And maybe some site that wasn't worthwhile before now becomes very worthwhile. And maybe China, can dominate that, or maybe China can't. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And I think when you look at rare earth history, it becomes exceedingly complex. And I've learned that every assumption that I make is pretty much wrong. I've been wrong in this industry way more than I've been right. That's for sure.
Question that was sent to by a member of the audience. I know that in terms of it's a little bit difficult for you to comment too much in terms of on like individual pricing of like rare earths. But the question that comes from the audience is, where is the best place to track rare earth prices?
So, you can use Asian Metal Pages. You can use various, you can go online and there are places that list it. on Chinese websites. They're fairly difficult to find. But just keep in mind, no matter where you get the prices, it's one of those things where you have to understand how they come to those prices. So it's not like everyone submits all their data, or that there is a rare earth exchange where data is, submitted, and then everyone can kind of look at it and say, okay, there is no real exchange for this stuff. And every end user may have a different specification for what they need. So it's not a commodity product. And in some of the markets it is, but for the rarest of the 15, but not really. For instance, lanthanum, you might use 3 nines purity, or you might use 5 nines purity. It depends on what your use case is. But that, 0.001% of the deleterious element that's in there, it might be really bad if it's, arsenic, but it might be okay if it's iron, or vice versa. So there's no one, commodity product that's out there that is rare earths. Every single end user has a different spec. So it becomes really difficult, to say, hey, this is the actual price of the item. This is what lanthanum is today, or this is what neodymium is today. Because those are based on, say Asian Metal Pages calling someone and saying, okay, what do you have? What was the latest trade? What did you trade? And when they get the answer, maybe it's, we only traded, 100 kilograms, or maybe we just traded 100, tons. And the price is going to be different for each of those. So it's really hard. I mean, they do a really great job, don't get me wrong. But I'm saying it's really difficult to nail down actual prices for actual rare earths because the market's so complex. It's not something you can just, look at a website and there it is, or pick up the phone and, hey, what is it? And they can tell you. It's really difficult.
And one final question, as we're running a little bit short of time from one of our listeners, is, does Clint think that the US will make good on re-establishing a domestic supply chain for rare earth elements?
Do I think we'll make good on that? Just know that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of expertise. There is no way to do this easy. And so, understand that, if we started now and we put good effort into it, it's possible. But there's a lot of things that need to happen for that to go right. And we have some things underway that are already, very successful. I mean, Mountain Pass is making product right now. So that is a positive, right? But there's a lot of other things in the supply chain that need to be there. And there's a lot of other, things that need to be done, and a lot of expertise that needs to be brought to the table. So, yeah, it can be done. And will they do it? I hope so. I hope that there's a significant effort to do that. But yeah, I think that's I guess my feeling on that one.
Okay. Well, I think that kind of like is coming up to the 45 minutes mark. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for Clint. Clint, it's been a pleasure having you. If people wish to get in contact with you, how can they get in contact?
So yeah, you can reach me via email is the easiest way, c.cox@theanchorhouse.com. And, I really do enjoy, discussing the industry. And, it's been a little quiet the last few years. So, of course, this is exciting times. So, thank you absolutely for having me on. And I'm happy to discuss anything with your listeners.
Okay. And as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, all registrants will receive a copy of the recording of this webinar via email. Thank you very much to Clint Cox. Thank you to our listeners for dialing in. If you want to learn more about rare earths, please check out the Anchor House. As demonstrated today, Clint Cox is one of the few people who really knows the intricacies and nuances of the rare earths industry. We will also be covering rare earths at our upcoming Minds and Money London conference on the 25th to the 27th of November. All listeners of this broadcast will be entitled to a discount by using a code that will be shortly coming up on your screen now. So register with the code RareWeb25 to claim a 25% discount. And also, for more great news and content, please check out our Mining Beacon website at miningbeacon.com. Many thanks, and see you again soon. Thank you.